Ice crackles in Hosa's bare feet as she clutches her silent baby. 10 Apache women face the mountain man's door, their knock a desperate prayer against the howling wind. He reaches for his shotgun, unaware they flee a massacre he will avenge. A storm like that didn't care about bones or blood or history. It chewed through everything. That's why he stayed inside most winters. That's why he let the fire burn low and kept a silence. He hadn't heard a human voice in years, not since they buried Ruth. Hollis didn't even get out of his chair when the knocking started. He thought at first it was the wind or maybe a branch slamming against the siding, but it came again. A pattern measured knuckles, not a branch, not a beast. Human. He hadn't had a visitor in 30 years. The last man who came up the ridge, uninvited, left with a bullet in his thigh, and the message clear. Holly's Ridge wasn't a place for company, but this knock wasn't defiant, it was desperate. He stood slow. His legs complained old from solitude. He reached for the shotgun out of habit, didn't it? Just held it as he opened the heavy wooden door. 10 women stood in the snow, blankets soaked through, hair stiff with ice, their faces hollowed by starvation, but their spines somehow still straight. The one in front, barefoot, spoke first, but not in English. Her voice was from cold, and she held something beneath her blanket, like a child or a wound. Hollis didn't understand the words. He didn't need to. He stepped aside. They filed in one by one, barely lifting their eyes. The youngest couldn't have been more than 15, and the eldest might have been his age or older. One leaned on another. One had a limp. All of them carried silence like it was the only thing they'd ever been taught to hold. He stoked the fire higher, set down the rifle, moved slow, careful not to crowd them. Didn't ask questions. Didn't speak. He handed the youngest a tin cup of boiled water and watched her fingers tremble so hard she nearly dropped it. Only after the door shut again, after the storm reclaimed the mountain behind them, did he feel what their arrival truly was. A crack in his world, a place where God's wind had carved open his silence and let in something unexpected. Warmth. They didn't tell him their names that night, didn't speak to each other even. They huddled close by the fire, blankets steaming, eyes glassy with a pain far older than this winter. He gave up his own bed, slept by the door with the shotgun in reach, not because he feared them, but because he feared what might have driven them here. The kind of thing that would send 10 Apache women into the snow with no supplies, no men, no weapons. Morning came, but the storm did not lift. The snow kept on, thick as cotton. He found himself watching them as they slept, each one thinner than she should have been. The barefoot one had frostbite, her toes swollen and raw. He rummaged through Ruth's old trunk for salves, for socks, for anything warm. When she stirred, she saw the salve in his hands and flinched, her fingers clutching her hidden bundle tighter. That's when he realized it was a baby, wrapped tight to her chest, not crying, not moving. He didn't touch her, just nodded, set the ointment near the fire, and left her to decide. By evening, she'd rubbed the salve in. Her eyes softened just barely. She tried to say something again, pointed at the child, then at the roof. Her words were clipped, uncertain. Then she put her hand to her chest. "Hosa," she said. He blinked. "That your name?" he asked. She nodded once. He pointed to himself. Holes the others watched quietly. No one else spoke, but something shifted in the room, like maybe the air remembered what it was to be shared. The next day he cleared out the storage room, brought in CS from the old shed, hung blankets over the windows, made space for them, not just in the cabin, but in the way his thoughts moved. He didn't know how long they'd stay. He didn't ask. He just kept feeding the fire and fixing what was broken. On the fourth day, one of them spoke. A woman with a scar along her jaw and eyes so dark they looked painted on. She said her name was Alawa. Her English was rough, but her story clear enough. Their village was gone. Soldiers, fire, death. The women who survived ran. They were not allowed to carry weapons, not allowed to defend what was theirs. They had walked for days, lost 3 sisters to the cold, buried them beneath rocks, and didn't cry. There was no time for crying, only surviving. And now here they were, in a white man's cabin, trusting a stranger because the world gave them no other choice. He listened, then went out and slaughtered a goat, made stew, fed them until they stopped shaking. That night he sat with his Bible in hand, flipping pages he hadn't read in years. He didn't look for verses, just let the paper sound fill the room. One of the girls, Taeda, came close and sat beside him. She didn't say anything, just watched him, her eyes locked on the way his fingers turned each page. God's word, he murmured, not even sure she understood. She reached out and touched the leather cover, then softly safe. He wasn't sure if she meant the book or the cabin or him, but the words stayed in his chest long after she returned to her place by the fire. Weeks passed. The women began to mend. Hosa's baby named Nanton finally cried. A good sign. They said he was alive just weak. Holly's built a new stove with an oven. They baked bread, laughed sometimes. The older women helped, so the younger ones chopped wood. Hosa began to smile. But peace never lasts, not in places where men want power more than they want decency. Tracks appeared in the snow, boot prints, horseshoes 2 days in a row. Halls didn't sleep that night. He oiled the rifle, sat on the porch long past midnight. When Hosa came to him holding the baby and asking if something was wrong, he just nodded at the woods. "Someone's watching," he said. She didn't ask who, she already knew. The wind had softened overnight, but it carried with it a weight that wasn't weather. Holly's could feel it in his bones, the kind of stillness a man learns to fear, especially after living 30 years with no company but the mountains. That quiet, unnatural pressing was always a warning. He rose early. The tracks had returned, this time closer. Not just riders skirting the woods, but boot prints at the edge of his clearing. Someone had come as close as the smokehouse and turned back. Holly's didn't have to guess why. He knew what kind of men scouted like that. The kind that liked fear. The kind that didn't expect anyone to fight back. Least of all a blind old rancher and 10 starving women. But they didn't know Halls. Not yet. He called Aloawa and Hosa outside and showed them the tracks. "We've got eyes on us. Might come closer next time." He didn't try to scare them. Just truth, plain and clean. Aloa's jaw clenched and Hosa pulled Nanton tighter to her chest, but neither woman turned to run. Aloa spoke first. "We stand or we vanish." He nodded. "Then we prepare." The cabin wasn't a fortress, but he built it solid. He reinforced the shutters, stacked firewood against the lower windows, and set snares around the perimeter, not for rabbits this time, but for boots. Hosa and the older women sharpened kitchen knives and kept them near. The younger ones hauled water from the well and filled every basin, barrel, and pot in case the pump was damaged. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing, and it gave them purpose. That mattered. Night came heavy. No one slept. They took turns watching. Holly sat in his chair by the door, shotgun resting across his knees, ears straining for any crunch of snow. When he closed his eyes, he didn't dream of Ruth for once. He dreamed of the fire outside being stamped out, one boot at a time, by shadows he couldn't see. He woke with a start before dawn. Smoke real this time, not from his chimney. He rushed outside. The smokehouse was burning, flames licking through the roof like tongues. The meat days of work was ruined, but that wasn't the worst of it. At the edge of the clearing stood 3 men on horseback. They didn't shout. They didn't move forward, just watched as the building collapsed in on itself. One of them raised a hand, mocking a kind of twisted wave, and turned his horse with slow arrogance. Gone before Holly's could even reach for his rifle. But the message was clear. "We know you're here. We know you're hiding something, and we'll be back." Aloa cursed softly in her native tongue. Holly's didn't ask what she said. He didn't need translation. Hosa had tears in her eyes, not from fear, from fury. He looked at her, then at Nanton, who had begun to cry again. "This won't stop here," Holly said. "They're testing us, seeing how far they can push." Allow drew in a breath. "Then let them push. We'll push back." Holly's admired her steel, but deep inside he knew the odds. 10 unarmed women, a baby, an old man, no town nearby, no sheriff to ride for, no help coming, just them. A burned-out smokehouse in winter pressing in. Still, he'd stood his ground before. He'd bury men if he had to. He taught the women how to reload, let them take turns holding the shotgun, feeling the weight. He handed Hosa a revolver with 3 rounds left and showed her how to aim. "Only if you have to," he said. "But if you do, don't miss." She nodded without flinching. That night, they slept in shifts again, but the attack didn't come. 2 days passed. The smokehouse still smoldered. The air stank of ruin. Hollis caught one of the girls, Taita, crying behind the shed. He sat with her in silence, watching the snow fall between the trees. "They burned it to scare us," she whispered. "Did it work?" he asked. She looked up. "No, but it made me sad." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Being sad don't mean being weak. Another 2 days, then the baby wouldn't stop crying." He was running hot, fever high. Hosa begged for help, tears falling as she rocked him. "He's too small," she whispered. "He won't last." Hollis didn't say anything. He didn't have medicine, but he remembered something Ruth used to do. He boiled willow bark into tea, rubbed his palms with pine tar, and let the steam coat the child's chest. Hosa watched every move like she was memorizing salvation. Nantun coughed, whimpered, then quieted again. By morning, the fever broke. Hope returned, fragile, but alive. That evening, as Hollis fixed the hinge on the front door, a single arrow landed in the snow near his boots. No sound, no warning, just a shaft of wood and flint quivering in the cold. He crouched slowly, picked it up, and turned it in his fingers. Apache make, but not theirs. He carried it inside and showed Alawa. She turned pale. "That tribe hates us. They think we betrayed them by running. That arrow means they're watching too. It wasn't just the white men now. It was their own people. No one wanted them. No one but Halls. And maybe not even him, if the outside world had a say in it." He threw the arrow into the fire and sat down hard. "No one's coming to save us." Aloha didn't argue. Hosa came and sat beside him. She placed her hand on his thin fingers, barely warm. "But you saved us once." He looked at her. Really looked. Not just her face, but the strength behind it. A mother, even if she was barely older than a girl, a survivor. "I just opened the door," he said. "You opened your heart," she replied. He didn't answer. Couldn't. That night, he prayed. First time in years, not loud, not with words, just a silent whisper toward heaven, asking for strength, for fire, for mercy, not for himself, but for them. In the middle of that prayer, he heard a sound outside crunching snow. He grabbed the rifle, opened the door, and standing there was a boy, Apache, maybe 12, thin as a shadow. He didn't speak, just held out a bundle of dried meat, laid it at Holly's feet, then ran, gone like smoke. Holly stood frozen, a warning, a gift, or a test. He took the meat inside, watched the fire burn low, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. The bundle of meat lay on the table untouched. No one dared speak of it, but all of them watched it. 10 pairs of weary eyes and one man's silence. Hollis kept glancing toward the door, toward the place where the boy had vanished into the dark. The wind had covered his tracks before morning, leaving no trace behind, as if the child were a ghost. They didn't eat the meat, not yet. Not until they were sure it wasn't a message in disguise. Hollis didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the hearth with the rifle across his knees, the fire low, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. He listened to the wind whisper through the eaves, the occasional crack of ice shifting on the roof. Nothing more, but his gut was restless. By dawn, snow had fallen again, enough to bury the smokehouse's charred bones, enough to quiet the world. When Holly stepped out, the only thing he heard was the groan of the trees and the crunch of his own boots. Then he saw them. More tracks. Not just the boy this time. He counted at least 5, maybe 6, approaching from the north, but turning away before the tree line, a half circle around the cabin. A scout's pattern, measuring, testing defenses, watching. They were being encircled. He went back inside, said nothing, and poured water into the iron kettle. The women noticed. They always did. Aloha finally broke the silence. They came again. Hollis nodded. Hosa asked the question he knew they feared. "Are they waiting for something?" "Waiting for us to run," he muttered. "Or weaken." He didn't mention the possibility that they might be waiting for night. No one needed that thought out loud. That afternoon, as Tyanita folded blankets by the fire, she found a feather tucked into the folds, smooth, clean, black with a silver tip. Not from any bird Holly's knew, not from this side of the mountain. He stared at it a long time, then burned it in the hearth. That night they stayed together, the fire burning steady. They sang softly, old hymns, mostly mixed with quiet Apache songs from the women's childhoods. The baby Nantan slept in a basket lined with rabbit fur, his breath shallow but peaceful. For a few hours it felt almost like a home until the scream broke the silence. It came from outside. A woman's voice, shrill and terrified, cut through the snow-heavy air like a knife. Everyone froze. Holly shot to his feet, rifle raised. The scream came again, closer this time. "Help, please, someone." It was a trap. He knew it instantly, but Hosa was already at the door. "That's a woman! No!" Holly's grabbed her arm hard. "They're drawing us out." Her eyes filled with tears. But what if it's real? Another scream broken. Desperate. Aloha clenched her jaw. "We decide now." Holly's looked at each of them. His heart pounded. "I go alone. No one follows." They argued, but he was already stepping into the dark. He moved like a ghost, every step measured. The scream had stopped. Only wind now. He followed the sound's memory to the tree line, heart tight in his chest. Then he saw her. A woman real barefoot in the snow, bleeding from the lip, clothes torn. She stumbled toward him with outstretched arms, crying, "They're coming, please!" "There!" An arrow struck the tree beside his head. He grabbed the woman and yanked her down behind a rock. Another arrow thudded into the snow behind them. A third skipped off the stone. He didn't fire. Not yet. A shadow moved near the ridge. Holly's waited, counted breaths, then fired once. The figure dropped. Not a man, a boy. He swore under his breath, not in anger, but in sorrow. Another silhouette appeared, running toward the fallen body. Holly's didn't shoot. He lifted the wounded woman, blood soaking through her dress, and dragged her back toward the cabin. The women opened the door and pulled her inside. Blood marked the floor. Hosa ripped linen for bandages while Aloha stoked the fire hotter. Holly's checked the girl's pulse shallow. Her name was Kaya. "She was running," Aloha said. "From someone or from something worse," Holly's muttered. The woman barely spoke. "Only one word, brothers." Then silence. She died 2 hours later. The snow outside glowed with moonlight, and Holly stood in it alone, burying her beside the smokehouse. No one sang this time. No prayers, just the thud of his shovel and the breath in his lungs. He marked the grave with a stone. That night the cabin stayed dark. No fire, no light. They sat in silence, hearing only the wind. But something shifted. The next morning the baby wouldn't stop crying. Not Nansen, another one. When Hosa opened the door, she found a bundle of fur on the steps. Inside it, a newborn girl. Clean, wrapped, left gently, and another feather. This one white. The message was clear. "You've killed one of ours, but you saved one too." They were being tested, watched, judged. Hollis took the child in his arms. She was quiet now, eyes closed, skin still warm from wherever she'd come. "What now?" Hosa whispered. "We name her," he said, "and we raise her same as the others." He didn't ask the women what they thought. He didn't need to. By that night, they were boiling goat's milk and feeding the child by spoon. Nantan stopped crying when she lay beside him, as if he recognized her. They named her Elise. 3 nights passed with no movement, no tracks, no arrows. Holly's worried more than ever. The silence was worse than the threat. On the 4th night, something changed. He woke to the sound of voices, not in English, not in Apache, but close enough to recognize mutters, laughter, rustling near the cabin walls. He crept to the window and saw a line of figures moving past the trees, dozens of them, torches, spears, and in the center mounted an older man in a white fur coat, face painted red and black. Hollis had seen him once years ago, a warchief exiled ruthless, and now he was here. The cabin would not hold, not forever. The first light of dawn didn't warm the mountain. It bled through gray clouds like a warning. Hollis hadn't slept, not a moment. His rifle lay across his lap, the butt worn smooth where his palm had rested all night. Through the frost-lined window, the torches had vanished. The warchief and his procession moved on, or pretended to. The snow outside was untouched. But that was a lie. There were no footprints because they'd covered them. Deliberate, trained. He'd seen Apache scouts do it when he was younger, and he recognized it now. A ghost war. They were circling, testing, closing in. He rose from the chair stiffly, his joints aching from the cold and stillness. The cabin remained quiet. 10 women and 2 babies slept in knots on the floor, leaning against one another for warmth. Hosa's head rested on Aloa's shoulder. Tenita cradled Alissi and Nanton between them, a barrier of arms and old strength. Hollis walked past them without waking a soul. Outside, he scanned the horizon, slow and steady. A rabbit darted across the edge of the woodline. A bird trilled somewhere far off. Too quiet, he spotted a rock, freshly disturbed, turned by a footstep, still warm beneath the frost. They were being watched, and not just from afar. He followed the ridge east, circling behind the smokehouse where Ka's grave lay undisturbed under snow and pine needles. He stopped beside it, tipping his hat. A low prayer passed his lips, not a practiced one, just words born from the tired ache in his chest. Then he saw it, another feather, this one black again, driven into the grave marker. That was no offering. It was a warning. By the time he returned to the cabin, the women were stirring, the babies crying softly. The smell of boiled milk and fresh pine filled the air. It could have passed for peace if it weren't for the tensions sitting on every shoulder. They were here again, Holly said, not bothering to wait for silence. On the ridge left another feather stood, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Are they trying to scare us out? No, Holly's replied. They're trying to see how far we'll go. Tonita's eyes narrowed. What happens when they find out? He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the chest beneath the table and took out the maps, spreading them across the floor. Routes, valleys, passes through the canyons. We need to think about leaving. That word hit the room like thunder. They de-worked to survive in this cold, had rebuilt the smokehouse, patched the roof, planted dried beans inside the root cellar to sprout in jars. Alicia and Nanton were growing, thriving even, and now just as it felt like home. You mean run? Hosa said quietly. I mean live, but not all of them agreed. We've run enough, Aloa said from soldiers, from our own, from everyone. I'm not asking you to run, Holly said. I'm asking you to outlive them. He didn't want to leave either. He'd carved this home from stone and silence, built it with grief in his bones. But the warchief wouldn't relent. They were a stain on this mountain in his eyes, a mistake to be corrected. Just think on it, Holly said finally, folding the maps away. That afternoon brought the first real warmth in weeks. Sunlight broke through the clouds, melting the snow in slow, glistening drips. Holly's took it as a gift, a brief window to prepare. They took turns watching the trees, shifts of 2 with the babies kept close. Halls walked the perimeter and set new traps, not for hunting this time, but for warning. Wire, glass, tin hung from branches to rattle at the slightest motion. Still, night fell heavier than the last. The torches returned, not near, just visible on the far ridges. A circle of them, 100 maybe more. Halls didn't count. He didn't need to. The warchief was showing his numbers. They had days at most. Then while Taita was patrolling near the brook, she heard something soft beneath the wind. A whimper. She followed it carefully, heart beating in her throat. Behind the boulder field where snow drifted deep, she found a child alone. No more than 6, barefoot, dressed in buckskin, shivering violently. She knelt slowly, whispering in Apache. The child didn't answer, just held out something with trembling fingers. A rag soaked in blood. Tonita carried the child back, wrapped in her own coat, lips pale, eyes hollow. Hollis met them at the door, his heart twisting. The boy had no name, no voice, just a necklace with a carved stone and eagle. The child's back was covered in lashes, whipped, beaten, left to die. Not punishment, a message. They brought him inside, fed him broth and milk, let him sleep. The boy didn't cry, not once. He just kept waking with eyes wide, afraid of where he was. That night, Hollis dreamed of fire. He saw the cabin burning, babies screaming, women fighting with kitchen knives. Smoke poured from the rafters and the warchief stood in the flames, smiling. He woke in a sweat, the sound of Alice's crying, slicing through the quiet. The baby was hot, burning up. Hosa checked her skin, red, damp, feverish. Water, she said, and willow bark. But they were out of both. The river was 2 mi down through enemy lines. Holly stood. I'll go. No, Aloha said. It's suicide. I'll go, Hosa offered, but Holly shook his head. No one else knows the signals. No one else sees like I do. He packed quick, canteen, rifle, rope, and stepped into the cold before anyone could argue more. The sun hadn't risen yet. Only the stars watched him pass into the trees. Every step was danger, every breath too loud. But he made it to the stream, filled the flask, dug for bark. Then a branch snapped behind him. He turned slowly. 3 men, Apache painted faces, spears. Halls raised his hands, said the words he remembered from youth. Words of respect, peace. They didn't attack. They watched him. Then one stepped forward and dropped a bundle at his feet, another blanket. Inside it dried roots, herbs, even a carved rattle. For the baby, one said in English, then vanished, just like that. Back at the cabin, they boiled the herbs, cooled skin. Her fever broke by morning. She slept calmly, lips curled into the ghost of a smile. Holly sat beside her for hours staring at the bundle. What changed? Alawa asked. He didn't answer, not directly. But deep in his gut, he felt something turning. They weren't enemies. Not all of them. Some were watching to see what kind of man he'd be. And maybe, just maybe, some hoped he'd survive. The next day, the boy spoke. Just one word. Kyun. It meant brother. Then he pointed to Alici's sister. That evening, Holly's called everyone together. They sat in a circle around the hearth, and he laid the maps out one final time. We stay, he said. They didn't question it because, for the first time, they didn't feel alone. The wind shifted that week, rolling down from the peaks with a sharper bite. It scraped against the eaves of the cabin like claws testing old wood, but inside warmth held barely. The hearth fire was kept alive by whatever they could find to burn, and Holly's had resorted to breaking apart a wooden chair he'd carved 20 winters ago, just to keep the children warm. They hadn't seen torchlight since that night the fever broke. No distant flames, no signals, not even a feather. It should have brought comfort, but instead it felt like silence before thunder. The kind Holly's had learned to read long before his hair turned gray. He watched the ridges every morning, not for the enemy, but for the stillness. That stillness had its own language, one of absence, of waiting. Hyun followed him often now. The boy didn't speak much, but what he lacked in words he made up for in eyes. Holly's had seen young ones before, torn from villages, broken from grief. But not like this boy. Kyun was still looking for someone. Maybe the mother he'd never name. Maybe a brother who never came back. But whenever he looked at Alici, his face softened as though she had become that tether. Inside, the women had grown more than just familiar with the land. They had made the mountain their own. The root cellar had been stocked with dried squirrel meat, apples from a hidden grove, and wild oats they'd gathered by hand. They'd fashioned new garments from torn hides, braided threads from pine bark, and stitched together broken moccasins for the children. And the babies, they were thriving. Nansen had begun crawling. Alici laughed when tickled. The sound of it filled the cabin like bells in a chapel, soft and unexpected. It was that laughter that made Holly's pause mid-repair on the porch railing one evening. His breath catching, he leaned the hammer down and sat on the step instead, head bowed. He'd once lived a lifetime without the echo of a child in his home. Now it came from every room. That night, as they gathered around the fire for supper, the past knocked softly as if asking permission. A figure approached the cabin just after dusk. No torch, no weapon, just a slow gait and a limp that spoke of an old wound. Holly's rose first, rifle in hand but unraised. The figure stepped into the light. Name is Emmett James, the man said, tipping his hat. He looked worn thin, skin wind-burnt, and hands scarred. I was told a man lived up here, took in some souls. Holly's did lower the rifle. Who told you? The man gestured behind him. No one, just followed the tracks. Snow's thin this side. You a scout? Used to be Union side, though that war's long behind me. Just looking for a place to be, sir. Ain't got much. Ain't asking for nothing but a floor and a chance. Aloha stepped out behind Holly's, her eyes scanning the stranger like she could see beneath his skin. After a moment, she gave the smallest nod. Holly sighed and stepped aside. Floor's hard, fire's warm. That enough for you? EMTT smiled faintly. More than I've had in a year. They shared no more than a fire that night. EMTT said little, just warmed his hands and stared into the flame. But the next morning he chopped wood without being asked, mended the barn roof, fed the chickens. You're not much for talking, Holly said, handing him a cup of boiled tea bark. Don't need to talk when your hands do enough, Emmett replied. 3 days passed, then 4. EMTT slept in the woodshed, took meals only after the children had eaten, and never asked questions. Then came the night of the blood moon. The sky turned red above the peaks, and the cold snapped colder than it had in years. Holly's woke with a sense he hadn't felt since the last war, the sense that something was moving beneath the snow. Sure enough, by sunrise the signs returned. Another feather, black, broken in half, left on the doorframe. Aloha found it. She didn't scream, just brought it in and laid it on the table like a dead bird. EMTT stared at it long and hard. Means they're close. Holly's nodded. Means they're done waiting. That evening they gathered around the fire again. And this time Holly's didn't sugarcoat it. They'll come in days, maybe less. They're not testing anymore. They're deciding. Then we make our stand. Tonyita said they'll outnumber us 5-1. Aloha looked up fierce. So did the blizzard. We're still here. I'm not willing to risk Alissi or Nanton, Holly's replied. We won't, Hosa said quietly. Well, protect them. But this is our home. You said it yourself. We stay. The women agreed. Even Cuny, small as he was, stood behind the decision, clutching the carved eagle on his chest. And so they prepared. The next days were spent fortifying the cabin. Holly's and EMTT dug trenches by torchlight, fashioned spears from saplings, and strung trip lines through the trees. Inside, the women boiled tar, melted tallow for torches, and packed the children's things in case of retreat. Then on the 5th night, the dogs began to bark. The ridgeline lit with torches, a wall of flame in the dark, but they didn't charge. Instead, one man came forward, alone, unarmed, draped in black furs. The warchief. Holly stepped out to meet him, rifle across his back, hands empty. You shelter traitors, the warchief said in broken English. You hide them from justice. They're not traitors, Holly's replied. They're survivors. Same thing. What do you want? The chief pointed to the cabin. The children? The women? They return with me. They'd rather die. The chief's face didn't change. That is allowed. Holly stepped forward. You'll have to kill me first. The chief smirked. That too is allowed. Then he turned and walked back to the line of fire. That night no one slept. The cabin was filled with silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of the hearth and the soft breathing of babes. At midnight snow began to fall, thick, fast, hiding the world. And then came the war cries. They rushed like ghosts from the trees, silent until they were. EMTT fired the first shot, then Hall's. The women moved like smoke, herding the children to the root cellar while the men held the door. Screams fire, snow turned red, but they didn't fall. Every man who stepped inside the cabin met steel or lead. Aloha drove a carving knife through the throat of one. Hosa cracked another's skull with a log. Hours passed, then silence, and then a scream from the woodshed. Holly's ran, slipping in the blood-slick snow. Inside, Emmett lay wounded badly, but beside him stood Kuhn, holding a blade, eyes wide but steady. The boy had saved him. And outside, as the first light broke over the mountain, the torches flickered out. They were gone, scattered. Holly's dropped to his knees in the snow, breathless. Behind him, the cabin still stood, burned, scarred, but standing. Inside, life stirred. The babies cried, and for the first time in 30 winters, the mountain felt like home to more than one. The battle was over, but its echoes remained. The snow around the cabin didn't melt for days. It held the stain of what had been fought for, lines of red where blood had soaked through and frozen in jagged, violent shapes. The roof had been singed, two walls splintered by axes, and half the root cellar had collapsed beneath the tremors of men's boots. But the cabin stood. The people inside it stood too, shaken, bruised, scraped raw by fear and exhaustion. But they were upright. EMTT lay on the cot for nearly a week, his shoulders stitched by Hosa's careful hands, his face pale from blood loss. He never once complained. When Hollis asked if he remembered the attack, EMTT only gave a slow nod and muttered, "Should have died 3 times before that. Guess I'm still behind on my dues." The women didn't cry, not until days later, not until the children were asleep, the door was locked, and the wind was calm enough to allow silence to speak. Tenita held Aloa's hand by the hearth as both trembled, not from cold, but from everything they had survived. Hosa sat close with the babies bundled in her lap, tears gliding silently down her cheeks. She'd lost family before. She debured them beneath the same kind of snow. But this grief was different. It came laced with gratitude, with relief. They had made it. Hollis, meanwhile, kept himself moving, fixing what he could, rebuilding what couldn't wait. But there were times he sat still too long, hammer in hand, staring at the empty spot near the barn where one of the enemy had fallen. Not because of the death, but because of what Kuhn had done. That boy, maybe 7 years old, had killed to protect them. Hollis remembered wiping the blade clean, finding the child afterward, huddled in the hay with blood on his hands and nothing in his eyes. "Kuhn," he said that night as they sat outside, the stars like frozen tears overhead. "You're not a killer." Kuhn didn't speak. "You did what you had to." The boy blinked. The faintest tear rolled down one cheek, but he didn't wipe it. "You're a protector now," Hollis added more gently. "There's a difference." The following morning, the women voted to hold a fire prayer. They gathered in a circle outside the cabin. Not a single word in English was spoken. Aloa lit the fire herself. Hosa and Teta passed around sprigs of cedar and bundles of dried sage. Kuhn stood between them, his small hands folded. Even the babies were silent. Hollis watched from a distance, not intruding. He didn't understand their language, not the words at least, but he knew the meaning. He felt it settle in the air like a benediction. Loss and healing, bound by flame. What had happened here would not vanish, but it would be remembered with reverence. That night the quiet felt deeper, not haunted, not heavy, just full of breath, of space, of rest. And then a sound they hadn't heard in weeks. Hooves, not many, just one. Holly stepped out to the porch, rifle slung over his back, and waited. A single rider came through the pines, cloaked in a patchwork of buffalo hides and dust. He dismounted slowly, lifting both hands. Greaves. I am name S. Tobias. I was headed to Eden Pass. Heard there was trouble in the high woods. Found a few stragglers down near Broken Needle. Looked like they were running from something they wouldn't name. Holly said nothing, only nodded. You need help up here. Halls considered. We've got mouths to feed, wounds to mend. I can lend a hand. Ain't much good with kids, but I got 2 legs and a spine. You believe in peace, Tobias? The man nodded once. I believe in food on the table and warm fires in the dark. If peace comes with that, then yes. Holly's offered a hand. Then you're welcome. Tobias settled in quickly, quiet, unassuming, but useful. The barn got patched faster. Traps were set deeper in the woods, bringing in more hares and birds. By the 4th day, he had earned even Aloa's trust, a feat Hall didn't take lightly. It wasn't just survival now. It was life, something more than breath and heartbeat. There were mornings when the sun came up over the ridge, and the smell of stew was already drifting through the cabin. Laughter rose more often than coughing. Kun and Alisi had created a game with stones and twigs. The women began carving again, not tools or weapons, but animals, gifts, and hollies. Without announcing it, began something too. On the far side of the cabin, beyond the old woodshed, he laid down stones, a foundation. No one asked what it was for until EMTT finally hobbled out and stood beside him. You building a coop? No. A stable? No. EMTT squinted at the shape. A schoolhouse. Holly smiled faintly. A home. We got one of those. This one's bigger for all of them, with room for more. EMTT chuckled. You planning on talking and more? Holly's didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was already in the stone. And then, just as spring hinted its arrival with softer winds and longer sun, the letter arrived. It was delivered by a traitor, a toothless man with frostbitten fingers and a mule that limped. Somebody said your name down in Pinneross. Ask me to bring this up, he muttered. The envelope was plain. No return, no seal. Holly's opened it slowly, fingers cautious. The message was short. More are coming. 15, maybe more. Young alone. They need somewhere. I remembered the mountain. No name, no date, just that. Holly showed it to Alawa first. She read it once and looked up. Then we get ready. Tanita heard next. 15, she repeated. That's more than this roof can hold. We'll build, Holly said before the thaw. Emmett exhaled a long breath. You sure, Greaves? That's a lot of mouths. I know you'll need help. I know. Aloha placed a hand on his arm. You're not doing this alone. No, Holly's replied, voice low but firm. We're doing this together. That night, the hammer rang again through the mountains. Stones were moved, wood was split, and when the stars rose over the peaks, they didn't shine on a hiding place. Not anymore. They shone on a refuge, a home, a start, for the wounded, for the lost, for the ones the world forgot until now. The thaw came early that year. Patches of earth began to appear between the drifts, brown and thawed and trembling with new life. The sky brightened, no longer a cold sheet of steel, but instead a patient blue. Wind still swept through the trees, but it was gentler now, carrying the scent of pine sap, wet soil, and something older. Hope. Down in the valley where the snow had already melted, a line of figures walked slowly up the slope. 15. Holly saw them before anyone else. He'd taken to walking the ridge every morning just after sunrise, not because he expected them yet, but because it steadied his heart. It reminded him to be ready. And when he saw that thin thread of movement, that line of shapes stumbling over thawing roots and broken rocks, he didn't panic. He turned and walked back toward the cabin. They're coming, he said simply as he passed the barn. EMTT, who'd been repairing the wheelbarrow, dropped his hammer. Now they're halfway up. EMTT rushed inside. Aloha met him at the door, already clutching extra blankets. Hosa grabbed dried meat and biscuits from the pantry. Tonita lifted the biggest kettle they had and set it over the fire without speaking. No one wasted time with questions. They knew what this meant. By the time the children arrived, tattered, starved, red-eyed, and limping, the cabin had a fire roaring, food waiting, and beds made. None of the orphans could have been older than 11. Some clung to one another. Others walked alone, heads bowed, too exhausted to cry. Hollies opened the door and didn't ask a single question. He just nodded. You're home. The oldest girl, maybe 10, stood in the middle of the room after leading the others in. Her name, they would learn later, was Saya. She didn't speak until everyone was inside and the door had closed behind them. This isn't what we thought it'd be, she said in a hoarse whisper. It's warmer. Halls knelt to meet her eyes. It's what you needed. That's all it has to be. She stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached forward and took his hand, small fingers trembling. Thank you. They didn't ask what had happened to the children. They didn't need to. Some things could be seen without being spoken. The bruises, the hunger, the way some of the boys flinched when a pot clanged too loud, or how the littlest girl refused to let go of her brother's sleeve even while she slept. But slowly, gently, things began to change. That night they made soup. It was simple beans, herbs, bits of smoked rabbit. But to the children, it tasted like something sacred. They devoured it in silence, then in murmurs, then in laughter. Emmett told a story about a goat he once raised that liked to eat boots, and a girl with no front teeth laughed so hard she spilled her bowl. No one scolded her, although it just poured another. By the second day, the children had started to speak again. Just small things, their names, what they used to eat. One said he liked drawing animals. Another whispered that she used to sing, but her voice had been taken by frost. Hosa sat with her on the stoop and hummed an old lullaby. When the girl didn't join in, Hosa smiled and kept humming anyway. "The voice doesn't disappear," she said quietly. "It just waits." By the third day, they helped with chores. Saya insisted on sweeping the floor. Two boys carried water. One of the smallest children, a boy who hadn't spoken at all, brought sticks for the fire and lined them up carefully, one by one, like soldiers. And by the fourth day, they played. It began with a snowball packed gently and tossed by Kuhn. It hit a boy in the arm. The boy blinked, then made one in return. Laughter followed. It was raw and bright and real. Holly stood watching from the porch, arms crossed. He hadn't known how this would go. He still didn't. But the weight in his chest had changed. It wasn't grief anymore. Not exactly. It was something heavier in some ways, but far more alive. It had shape now. Names, faces, family. And yet, even in the peace, Holly's felt the old instinct stir, because peace didn't last unless you guarded it. That night, once the children were asleep, Holly sat by the fire with Aloha, Emmett, and Hosa. "We need a plan," he said. "This can't just be charity. We need to build something lasting." "A school," Aloha said first. "A garden," Hosa added. "A wall," Emmett muttered. They were all right. The days that followed were filled with labor, but no one called it work. A space behind the barn became the site for the schoolhouse. Stones were laid out again, but this time by many hands. Even the children helped, carrying rocks and tying bundles of twigs for the roof. Kuhn painted a sign for the entrance, though he couldn't write more than his own name. He just painted stars. "We need books," Saya said one morning, "and chalk and blankets for the benches." "We'll get them," Holly's promised. He had no idea how, but the words felt true when he said them. The weather warmed, streams returned, rabbits bred again, and the woods grew loud with birds. Tobias, who had never intended to stay more than a week, now spent his evenings teaching the children how to whittle and fish. "Every one of these little rascals needs a trade," he muttered. "They ain't gonna grow up lazy." They weren't. Even the smallest ones now carried themselves taller. They knew they had a place, that they were wanted. One night, as the sky turned red with dusk, Holly stood on the ridge again. He looked down at what had once been a solitary cabin. Now it was a village. 3 cabins under construction, a schoolhouse nearly finished, a fenced area for goats, a smoking rack near the trees, children running, women laughing, men working, a life blooming where only survival had once lived. He felt someone beside him and turned to see Alawa. "You're thinking about your wife again," she said gently. "Sometimes. I think this is what she saw before I did." Aloha nodded. "She gave you time to find it. She would have loved this place." Aloha didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and stood beside him as the light faded. That night, the first of the older boys, an 11-year-old named Nantan, asked Hollies if he could help keep watch. "I know how to load a rifle," he said. "I just want to make sure everyone's safe." Hollies nodded. "We take turns here. You'll have yours." Nansen grinned like he'd been Ned. Later in the dark, Hollies whispered a prayer before sleep. Not for protection, not for more provision, just thanks. He had never asked for this life. He had never expected it, but it had come anyway. The final snowfall melted the next morning, revealing not ruin but roots. And from those roots, the mountain breathed something new. Not silence, but songs. The wind had changed. Even the trees knew it. The season had turned, not just from winter to spring, but from survival to something softer, richer, and more deeply alive. It came not with a roar, but with small signs. The unfurling of buds on the trees, the chorus of frogs down in the marsh, and the children's laughter echoing between the cabins like music made of sunlight. And yet peace had to be kept. The mountain taught them that much. On the morning of the spring market, Holly stood outside the schoolhouse, tying a bundle of dried meats and herbs into a burlap sack. Tobias had brought news weeks ago. Traders would be gathering at Pine Hollow again, the first time since the snow. That meant supplies, cloth, salt, maybe even books. But it also meant stories would travel faster. Questions would be asked, and someone might wonder what a weather-worn man was doing, raising 10 Apache women and 15 orphan children on a hidden ridge with no government record and no official blessing. But Hollis didn't flinch. He had chosen this life with his eyes open, even if his heart had still been healing when it began. Now it beat steady. Beside him, Aloha sorted buttons into a tin. Hosa stitched a tear in Kuhn's coat. EMTT carried a list of things they needed, and the children ran wild, knowing the market day meant new shoes, maybe sweets, maybe stories. One of the little girls, Tassie, stood on tiptoe and whispered to Hollis, "Can we get red ribbons this time?" "Only if you help carry the flour," he said. She beamed and ran off, already pretending her hair was braided with silk. The trip to Pine Hollow was long, but not dangerous. With EMTT guiding the wagon and 3 older boys riding alongside on borrowed ponies, they made it in just under 2 days. When they arrived, the town was already buzzing. Stalls were set up, smoke curled from kettles, and the clang of blacksmiths echoed down the lane. But something changed when Holly stepped into view. People stopped, heads turned. He was remembered after all. Not just as the man who'd buried his wife during the blizzard a decade ago, not just as the trapper who used to come down twice a year with hides, and never a word more than necessary, but as someone changed, there were children clinging to the wagon now. Girls with long black braids and solemn eyes. Boys wearing hand-sewn boots and pride in their spines, and behind them more waited on the ridge. 10 women, survivors, builders. Whispers started, but no one stepped forward with trouble. Instead, the blacksmith's wife, a round woman with an apron dusted in flour, marched up and handed Tassie a bundle of ribbons. "She looked at them last year," she said gruffly. "Didn't have the coin. I saved them anyway." Hollis nodded. "She'll treasure them." And she did. They traded steadily. Barrels of dried meat for salt and beans, spare hides for new boots, 2 smoked trout for a bolt of cloth the color of river clay. But as they were loading the last of it, a man in a fine hat and a long coat stepped out from under a porch and cleared his throat. "Name Essert Klein," he said. "Territorial authority." Hollis turned slowly. "I've heard stories," Bertram said, "about a place up in the mountains. Women who don't belong to any town, children with no papers, and a man building cabins without permission." "We're building a life," Holly said evenly. "Not a threat." "That's not always how folks see it," Bertram replied. "You understand, I'm sure. We're still shaping laws out here. Gotta know who's where doing what. Protect the landowners. Keep order." Hollis didn't blink. "What do you want?" "A visit next full moon. You show me what you've got going. I write my report. If it looks like a settlement, we file it. If it looks like a family, maybe I write nothing." EMTT shifted beside him, but Hollis raised a hand. "You come," he said to Bertram. "You see?" The man nodded once and turned. No threats, just bureaucracy. But as the wagon rolled out of town, EMTT spat into the dust. "We'll build that wall after all." Back on the ridge, the children greeted them like heroes. There were cheers for the bolts of cloth, squeals for the red ribbons, and a stunned silence when Kuhn pulled out 3 actual books, dog-eared and weathered, but full of stories. Aloha held one to her chest and closed her eyes like she was praying. And that night, for the first time, they held a dance. Tobias brought his fiddle. Tacy's ribbon streamed in the firelight. The children clapped and stomped, and Hosa and Alawa laughed like girls again. Even Hollis, reluctant as always, was dragged into a slow circle and made to smile. EMTT handed him a cup of cider and nodded toward the stars. "She'd be proud," he said. Hollis didn't answer. He just looked out over the ridge where the cabins glowed with firelight and let himself believe it. A week later, the children gathered pine cones and painted them for luck, they said, so we don't get taken away. No one had told them that was a risk, but they'd heard enough in their short lives to know that homes could be stolen. So Holly stood with them, dipped his hands in paint, and rolled one of the pine cones in his palms. "Then we'll make hundreds," he said. "Enough luck to last a lifetime." They hung them from trees, from doorposts, from fences. They weren't afraid anymore, but they weren't fools either. When Bertram returned, he brought 2 men with him, silent, watchful. But when they stepped into the settlement, they paused. The schoolhouse was finished, 15 children learning letters, 10 women preparing lunch in a kitchen built of cedar and sun, a field with rows of onions and carrots, a barn with goats, a boy tending to a calf, and in the center, Holly stood with Tassie on his shoulders, her red ribbons fluttering like flags. Bertram walked the grounds for hours. He asked quiet questions. He took notes. He sat with Alawa and listened to her describe each child's chore schedule. He watched as EMTT taught 3 boys how to mend a fence. He sat under the schoolhouse eaves and listened to Hosa read a story about stars. When it was time to leave, he folded his notebook slowly. "This isn't a town," he said. Holly's didn't respond. "It's not even a village, really." Still, Holly said nothing. "It's something else." Bertram turned to his men. "We write nothing. This place doesn't exist on maps. Let it be." And then to Holly's he said, "But if you ever need a new roof, you let me know. I hammer a straight nail." Holly's nodded once. That evening, as dusk fell like a soft blanket, Holly's climbed the ridge alone. He sat where he always had, where the old silence used to live, and listened. But it wasn't silent anymore. It was full with laughter, with stories, with prayers whispered in the dark, with pine cones hanging like charms, with red ribbons and school bells and the sound of boots stomping snow from the porch. He thought of his wife, and though he still missed her every day, he knew now why she had gone. So he could find them, so they could find him, so they could all make something that would last. And in that moment, the wind shifted again, carrying not just the scent of spring, but the promise of tomorrow. 5 years passed, and the mountain never forgot them. The cabins aged with grace, their wood weathered silver by snow and sun. New ones had risen too, built not from desperation, but planning, each one sturdy, wide-windowed, filled with warmth. The children were no longer children. Kuhn had a beard now and spent his mornings teaching younger boys how to build traps and skin game. Tassie, once the smallest, now braided her hair with new red ribbons and taught letters under the roof she once learned beneath. Holly's, older and slower, still walked the ridge each dawn, but he didn't carry grief anymore. Just a cane carved by one of the girls who now called herself a carpenter. He'd become something more than a rancher or guardian. He was legend to those children, root to their branches. Weddings had come, babies too, not his, but his heart stretched enough to hold them. One day Tobias returned, white-haired and leaning heavy on his mare, but his fiddle still strapped to his back. "Heard the mountain grew a town," he said with a grin. Holly's just smiled. "Not a town." "No," Tobias asked. Holly shook his head. "Family." They sat beneath the old pine where the first shovel once met the earth and watched as young voices echoed up from below. 10, 20, maybe more now. Not bloodbound, but bound all the same. By love, by loss, by shelter found and chosen.